Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first show of the week because it was my birthday yesterday and I went and did other stuff. Anyway, he's back. Dr. Philip Blood, the Guv'nor, Dr. Aachen is here to answer questions about the ETO, Nazi leadership, the battles of autumn, winter 1944, and anything else that people are putting in the sidebar there. His Substack, previous World War II TV shows, and a couple of the books are, of course, listed in the description below. I'll bring him back. Good evening, Phil. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. And thanks for bringing me back to at least finish off some of the long talk the other day. I hope everybody's prepared for at least 10 minutes of me.
Yeah, you're going to do us like a summary at the beginning and then we'll do the questions. So, as always, you got people thinking about lots of things last time. But, let's hear your kind of final thoughts then.
So I think people might have guessed by the title of the book, Genius for Evil, the Colonial Origins of Auschwitz and Modern German Politics, that the book is about the path paved by the German army to Auschwitz. But the book isn't specifically about Auschwitz camp. It's much about the thread that goes from the colonial history through the First World War, through Weimar. I actually finish in about 2000, where certain policies, certain strategies continued in German politics, and I'm trying to tie up the whole of, in a sense, masterwork of the 20th century. The slide which I made at the end, which was for looking at Guderian and deconstructing what actually happened to him. Why I did that was to say, look, we've just been through a period of serious war crimes and genocidal behaviour set by the German army in Atrocities and what actually happened in Warsaw, and there's a host of other places. And that they came out, the German society came out of the Second World War with people like Guderian who managed to escape from any kind of justice and were popularized both in their personal writings and by people like Liddell Hart and Slam Marshall and others, and that set a ball rolling. And academic historians have had a devil of a job over the years to deconstruct the kind of web that people like Guderian weaved back in the late 40s and early 50s. And what I wanted to do on that was to show that actually, when you get down to it, his books were actually drafted while he was in US military prison in that period, 1945-46, before he was sent to Nuremberg. And I think that's important to know, that his narrative was not set by him, it was largely set by his captors. I wanted to obviously discuss a side of the German military operations which often gets forgotten, and that's the economic side, and how matters like scarcity and the fear of not being able to sustain battle drove the German army to a style of warfare which you could see continue right the way through the period, which is why I kept showing those continuity slides. The thing that I found interesting in all the research that I've done is how far the infantry has dictated the German way of war. I mean, we've all tended to think like it's the Panzer divisions, it's the Luftwaffe working in combination, Bewegungskrieg, Blitzkrieg, whatever we want to call it. But when you actually get down to it, the fundamental power of the German army was the infantry. And that dictated a huge amount, whether they would control ground. The infantry have a certain way of fighting, which is different from the panzers, obviously. And that discipline that they had for infantry warfare was continued into even Kampfgruppe operations or mainstream operations like Barbarossa. And that dictated how they were going to fight their war. And they continued right the way through to the end. That never changed. And then finally, I would say, an aspect that we haven't really looked at is how the royalty, the army high command, and the Nazis almost carried on the same policies over a period of 40 years. And that led to certain extremist behaviors, which is why, people like Jürgen Zimmer, my friend, and you could hear his talk on my Substack page. We discussed. I uploaded his discussion yesterday. He talks about Herrera being the beginning of this trend towards a trajectory of genocidal violence, and I think that's an important aspect that we have to continue to put back into our stories and our history, that a lot of this fighting was developed over this fighting power of the German army was developed over a long period of time. And you can't just say, well, it would, they developed this in Weimar and they developed that in the First World War. They just did that in the Second World War. It's a long trajectory. And the spine of that trajectory is the infantry and then the powers behind how that developed, which to me was quite important. And as I say, the book I'm presently writing and hoping to finish sometime this year. It's still a bit of a battle. There we are. That's my end.
Well, thank you very much. So we've got quite a few questions in the sidebar. Jamie Lundy kindly sent his in earlier, so Phil could consider them. I'll put them up on the screen now. So the first one Jamie's asking you is about Poland and atrocities in Poland. So Jamie says, in your book, Birds of Prey, you talk about the forest there, but are you aware of what German units were liquidating the Jews in Janów Poliski in eastern Poland now? I'll try that again. Ivanova in Belarus.
And right, what I've done is I've sent you a link to a Yad Vashem site, which has coverage of the massacres at this Polish village, and you could pass it on to Jamie because I didn't have his address. You'll find it in the Blue Sky DMs.
Yeah, I've got that. I will put that in the chat straight away, so it's there for people to see. So there you are, Jamie. There is a chat there, and for context, that's to do with Jamie's family being there, and some of his relatives who ended up staying in that part of Poland, or were in that part of Poland, witnessed some of those atrocities. So I've just put the link in there for you now, folks. It should be there. There it is, folks. You can go and find that and read that out there. So that's the first question underway. So that's good stuff. Thank you very much. Jamie has a second question, which I think is a good one to kind of ask at the beginning of this conversation about the difficulties of your work, in the sense that you're writing about subjects that are very often very dark, often very depressing, but at the same time you must get some sort of satisfaction about the work you do and uncovering these kind of things. So Jamie said that. What is the most difficult subject you've covered, and what has been the most satisfying, if that's not an inappropriate use of the word? So in terms of you're writing about Germany and the German population. So there you are. There's the question, sir.
Well, I would say to Jamie that the hardest story of my work is the bit where we spent all those years, between 10 and 14 years, unlocking the Luftwaffe papers and maps and combat reports. At one point, I nearly gave in. The Holocaust Museum in America, DC, took my work and produced an article for the Holocaust and Genocide Studies journal, and we were still at that point in vague ideas of what had actually happened. We then, by chance, asked a friend of ours who was a veteran German soldier, and he immediately recognized the text was military shorthand. He explained how you would translate all of that, and that then opened up the maps so that we could actually understand what was going on the maps, because there was loads of arrows and all sorts of things going on. We couldn't literally understand how the maps were working and the grid references. That then was all opened up, and then of course, as people know, Bettina assisted me with her expertise in geographical information systems, and she created the maps. So that I would say was the hardest specific period of heavy research. What I'm doing now is hard because although the Bielovis Biavisha project started almost the same time as my PhD back in 1997 when I first found the Luftwaffe files. The First World War story began to emerge. So the one that I'm working out now also emerged at the same time I was doing my PhD. So basically, we're almost going back to what the PhD unleashed. And I would say the satisfying moment in my academic career was when Professor Richard Holmes addressed me as Dr. Blood. And then we all went down the pub and had a few beers with Chris Bellamy and Keith Simpson.
Fantastic stuff. So talking of archives and research, we had a question just come in from Stephen. Is some information or records related still locked up, or have you experienced not being given documents due to the topic of research? Because it's one of those kind of things that people talk about, whether they're talking about the British archives, American archives. There's always that, well, some archives are still under lock and key, or they're not being released. And yes, there are definitely. I know, living in France, the names of families in France who are officially collaborators. I think it's another 15 years. I think it's 100 years before they will be released. So in your particular field, Guv'nor, are there archives that you still can't get to that you know of, or have there been archives that have been more tricky to get to than others?
When we were working on a denazification archives for Aachen Chamber of Commerce, one of my students managed to convince one of the archivists in Dusseldorf to give us access to files which we weren't supposed to have access to until 2030. It was quite interesting because it was a pure accident, and we had just literally 4 hours before they'd noticed that we had the files, and we were scribing madly because back in those days you couldn't take your laptops and stuff with you, so everything was pencil and paper. And we were scribing all this content down. And I completely forgot that some of this content was still under control until 2030. And when I wrote the Aachen book and published it the other year, I had to phone up my editor, lovely lady, and panicked for 24 hours saying, please scrub those 2 paragraphs because if it goes out, I could be in trouble. There is another side to this. In America, you think everything is open access and is available, but there's a whole load of files which are in the on the shelves, which have never been, as far as I know, not been opened. And I was very lucky because I'd worked for so long in the National Archives. Robin Cookson took me down to the stacks and said, do you want to look at this stuff? And it was all British intelligence papers, which, funny enough, were not open in Britain at the Kew Archives. And I think I alluded when I was talking about Bonnie Punchev last time that I waited until his wife had passed before I considered writing that book because I didn't want people to get into trouble and, MI6 connections. So there is a responsibility, you have to be very careful. So there are moments when you confront files which are closed and you shouldn't open because of the personnel matter.
Okay, thank you very much. And it is one of those things that I think I find that people think because there is so much stuff available online that therefore everything is online. And the simple fact is, I wouldn't like to put a figure on what percentage of wartime archives are online, but I would pulling a figure out my arse, I would say less than 10% probably. And there's a lot more to come.
I saw the post-mortem reports on British soldiers who had been massacred in Normandy, and there were some fairly graphic pictures that were floating around. There's a binder of some graphic pictures, but there was actually a folder of the original photographs, the large format photographs that the British military correspondents and photographers would take pictures with, all Crown copyright. And I remember seeing them just before they were supposed to be released. And I think then they got taken away and pushed aside and were left out. And of course, there was all that chaos in the 90s when Guernsey, Jersey and the Channel Islands files were being opened up. And there was all that speculation as to whether the British people were collaborators and so forth. And of course, that becomes very heated. Similar story has just been happening recently in Holland, with certain files opening up showing or revealing facts of collaboration. And as I've said, history is political. It doesn't matter how hard people try and say military history is only military. History is political, and it's when you get into those subjects, the politics can really fly. So yep, there are consequences.
Okay, thank you. So going back to some of the early questions, and folks, just sort of hang fire putting any more, because I've got like 18 stacked up now, which is enough to keep us going for a bit. So Andreas, regular viewer, said at the beginning of this, I think the Munich Soviet Republic episode had a huge impact on Hitler's and other later Nazi leaders' hate of communism and anti-Semitism. What does Dr. Phil think about this? And part of the things we've always enjoyed in our conversations, Phil, is taking things back to pre-1933, taking things back before where we obviously think of the roots of all this stuff. So, you know, I always know from my education that, you know, growing up in Britain, you know, in the 1920s, fear of Bolshevism was way more of a thing in some ways than fear of what was happening in Germany. It was the Russian royal family being relatives of the British royal family, all that kind of stuff, and Rasputin and things like that. But hate of communism, is communism the right word in that context, or is it Bolshevism and anti-Semitism?
Well,
what do you think about this?
It's mostly Bolshevism, and a lot of the time it gets bound up with Jewishness, and so you get Jewish Bolshevism and so on and so forth. To address Andreas's comment directly, what you get in Munich is the Red Republic, which causes a counter-revolution. This is in 1918, 1919. And there is extreme fighting. And in my book, Hitler's Bandit Hunters, I use the tactics that were from the Wartburg against Herrera in 1904, that the same Ritter von Epp, who'd taken part in the Wartburg, used exactly the same tactics to destroy the communist movement in Munich. In the talk last week, when I was showing pictures of the Escherich brothers, both Bavarians, both from Munich, both involved in Munich University, they were in the center of the fighting. And it's interesting that Karl, who was involved in gas and fumigation research, became very close to Adolf Hitler, while Georg Escherich, more of a colonialist and royalist, went in the direction of Ritter von Epp and the old monarchy. And it's those kind of splits and divisions which dominated at the time of Hitler's early moves into politics, and as we later know, took part in the Munich Putsch in 1923. It's not consistent though, so I'm going to go off on a drift for a minute. If you look at what happened, if you look at what happens in Aachen, so Aachen and Munich, both Catholic cities, both technically anti-Prussian in many ways. Aachen is very rapidly occupied by British soldiers, then French soldiers, and then it's given over to Belgium. You don't, because it's a demilitarized zone and the Allies are focused on that area, you don't get the same kind of uprising as you would in, as you did in Munich. So you're not carrying, you know, all the German cities are experiencing different aspects at that stage. And you don't see a rise. You do see a communist party develop, but it's not like the extremists in Munich.
Thank you. Great response to that one there. I think I'm taking these questions in the order that they kind of appeal to me. I think you'll like this one from Trevor, although it could be a massive, great rabbit hole leading to a warren of more rabbit holes, because it's right up your street. So Trevor is saying, how could army staff share the same historical and cultural common ground? E.g. von Arnim, a Prussian noble, intellectual, and anti-Semite, versus Rommel, a Swabian who never went to staff college. I mean, this is one of the things, you know, you were talking on the last show about Prussian and Bavarian, and I think, you know, those of us who grew up with the war films, we kind of think of all German officers as being very much the same. They all got that clipped way of speaking, and so for you as a boy, it's over, Tommy. But there's a whole variety to German culture. So there you are. There's the question: what was the common denominator in these people who had so different backgrounds and ancestries and what have you?
Well, I think what actually happens with officers like those is they've gone through the period. Remember, if I was talking about the federated armies, which existed during the imperial time. So I think Rommel went into a Baden-Württembergische regiment. I'm not too sure about von Arnim, but I'm sure it was a Prussian regiment. And at that stage, there would have been a cultural difference between them, and to a certain extent, that lasted into the First World War. And if you're reading correspondence of that period, it's quite often that the Swabians are being insulted by the Prussians are being insulted by the Bavarians. The personal papers of the Escherichs, and as I was saying before, having gone through the papers of the 41st Army Corps operations in the East, there was Hoffman and people talking about those being Prussians not being up to it, or those Bavarians being typical, running away. And so there is that difference. What I contend, and this might be a strange calculation for people, but I think with the reduction of the army after the Great War in 1918, under the Treaty of Versailles, effectively, that is more powerful at making Germany a united nation than all the armies after the period 1871 up to 1914. Part of it is we're not allowed to celebrate, so we will celebrate and we will remember these regiments. And so lineages are kept. But as the Reichswehr develops its own culture, and the way Hindenburg pushes the old parts of the old military culture, while at the same time making it easier for people from transfer from one position to another. So you see von Secht and others in various places, and Rommel coming in and then moving along. It's like Varlamont. I spent a lot of time watching Varlamont. His early days in the 1920s and 30s was spending an awful lot of time doing industrial work with universities. So what happens after the Great War is there's this, it's almost like they're all brought together, and that nation building is highly effective. And by the time Hitler comes to power, what you've got is the nucleus of a truly national army, which is what it becomes, as we know it, the Wehrmacht and Das Heer. But that probably couldn't have been done in 1914 because they were different and they had different attitudes towards how they fought. And while some of the cultural background of the regiments remained, and obviously generals retained some of their cultural memories, it's very interesting how they've become German. So you see Bulk. Bulk isn't complaining about Guderian because they're both from different parts of Germany. He's complaining because his specialism isn't quite what, it's not quite up to what he thinks his specialism should be. So they find a compromise, and I think that compromise is they actually become German in the sense of Germany, rather than the federated German soldiers of the period up to 1914. And actually, I've argued that in the book.
Thank you. And on a kind of similar question from Veronica about sort of what is being of a certain nation. Veronica says, What about mention build differences between the USA, the UK, the USSR, and Germany? What was an image of what's valuable, and how did that influence an art of war? So, kind of human image. We're kind of getting into sort of philosophical discussions now, Phil. But do you have a response to that that will not baffle us who are not quite as intelligent?
I'm just an ordinary Joe. Look,
no, you are, but I'm not.
The German soldiers have if you put all the soldiers together, they all dump, they all have sex, they all eat, they all go through that process, and that's why I put the page up about the three, the soldiers, the Lanzer in the First World War, the Lanzer in the Second World War. They have these commonalities. You put the Russians together with the Germans, there wouldn't be a lot of difference. One's got historic realism and communist, this, that, and the other. But when you get down to it, soldiers express themselves in what I would call the lower end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is food, sex, basic survival. And I think that creates an unusual bond. And okay, does that influence the art of war? Yes, when the infantryman is dominating the German army. In the UK, the British Army fights, again with the infantry, but it's a much more of a mobile, mechanised force. It's much more advanced in its thinking. And I know this sounds radical, but even though the tanks weren't very good, the British knew how to use its equipment in such a way which is a lot more dynamic, because they didn't have to rely on tons and tons of fodder for their horses. So that created a different culture in military operations. The British were a lot more mechanized, oily rags, that kind of approach. The Americans are different again. But at the same time, if you put all four combat soldiers down on the ground together, I'm sure they'd recognize each other without much difficulty. When you overlay them with ideology and dogma and doctrine and this, that, and the other, then they begin to lose their identity. And I think that's one of the problems we have. We spend an awful lot of time talking about National Socialism. It's quite possible that many of the people I met, like Henry Mettelman, he would constantly go on and say, he raises his right arm every day when he was a young man and he was a total Hitler Youth. That's understandable. But on the other hand, when he was talking about being a soldier on the Eastern Front, his misery was much the same as I'd heard from a Russian soldier whose misery was pretty horrible. And my grandmother's friend back in Manchester, who was from the Polish army, he talked about some horrendous lifestyle before the war had even started, just being in the ranks of the Polish army. So there are commonalities, there are differences.
Thank you.
I'm not sure
I've
if I'm
always
answering
found
that very well.
No, you are. I mean, I've always found that I understand motivations of why people go to war, motivations of why people serve their country. I think when it comes at kind of the brainwashing end of ideology, I understand it, because they're just kind of swept up by something they don't fully understand. I understand at the other end, if that maybe is not the other end, but on the circle somewhere, is just that sense of people fighting for the guy beside them. I've always got that understanding of, and I think that's fairly universal. When you speak to a person who landed on Omaha Beach, in their latter years, they might say they were fighting for democracy, they were fighting for a better way of life. But actually, the reason they get out the landing craft is probably because they were fighting for the guy on the left of them and the guy on the right of them, and that unit they had trained with. And I tend to think that is universal across all armies in all periods of history to some extent. Especially if you're on the side of good, if that isn't a weird concept. But when it gets into that sort of other reasons why people fight and what the principles that are a bit more difficult to pin down, I get a bit more confused by that.
I get a bit wary with the motivation thing. When soldiers have been conscripted into military forces, they don't have an awful lot of choice. And remember, I spend more of my time looking at the ordinary ranks and the ordinary soldiers in fighting. And, you know, if you have a conversation with a Second World War veteran and he tells you that I was highly motivated for this, that, and the other, and I was doing this and doing that, I become immediately skeptical. And I would go back to John Ellis's book, On the Sharp End, written in, I think, the 70s or 80s. And Ellis made this point that the British Army had 5 million men in the Second World War, and about 100, I think he came up with a number like 120,000, 130,000 actually saw combat. How come, therefore, there are all these stories of the war circling around when such a small margin of soldiery actually participated in front fighting? And he was very scathing about what happens in culture and memory, about how families want their loved ones to have been brave soldiers. So the pressure is on them. The pressure is on them from their own families, insisting that they're this, that, and the other. And I can understand why an awful lot of soldiers didn't want to talk about their Second World War experience, because in quite many cases, they didn't actually fight. With the German army, an awful lot fought. It's very difficult to find many who actually had a cushy number, so to speak, like, you know, in British Army. They were exposed to a lot of fighting from very early on, and some of them, they'd do 1,029 days. If I remember rightly from my friend who studied German infantry division back in the 90s, I think he was suggesting that his troops were in constant operation for 1,029 days. When you think about it, that's an awful lot of time. That's an awful lot of stress and pressure. And the German infantry division had to cope with that kind of... So it puts a different level of motivation. I mean, I hear what... I'm cautious about how we deal with motivation and ordinary soldiers.
No, fair enough.
That doesn't mean that soldiers don't volunteer for war. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about on the general spectrum of conscript soldiers fighting at the lower level there.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll do some more less philosophical questions and some more sort of direct, specific ones. So Jason, who did a fantastic Aachen urban warfare show with us, and you talked about Aachen as well, and you are Dr. Aachen. Since Dr. Aachen and I discussed the battle in October 2024 on your Aachen week, has he found any new evidence on anything related to the urban fighting within the city?
Well, I found that, I'm going to have to be careful how I put this, but I found that most of the combat reports that were produced by the US Army were written after the battle and were quite often inaccurate, imprecise, and were not correct. I think it was very interesting that the stories that the urban warfare have been largely based upon, most of those were written in about 1946-47. Based on the flimsiest of evidence. The interesting thing about all of this Aachen story and the urban warfare is it was going to be a historical topic. I think I explained this before. It was being planned as the American army had this victory on the first German city. And the historians, the scribes working for Slam Marshall, arrived in the city and started to interview people. And it's pretty clear there were those units that were quite happy to be interviewed, and there were those who were not at all interested in being interviewed. And there was a whole group who I kind of got the impression objected to what had actually happened, because with the break-in by the SS forces on around about the time that Cowboy Pete was sacked by Bradley, when they broke in, they hit the American, it's vague now, I'm going to sound pretty daft not being able to remember it, but I think it was the 3rd Battalion as it was coming through the built-up area going up towards the Kurhaus. and the Quellenhof Hotel, and this SS kind of strengthened Kampfgruppe battalion, Sturmgeschütz battalion, smashed into the side of them and caused them considerable casualties. And at the same time, there was bitter fighting across that area. I don't know if you remember the Quellenhof when you came, Woody, but that area is wooded, it's hilly, it's confused, and underneath there was all the drains, and the SS could take advantage of the drains, come up behind the Americans, gave them a bit of a hiding. The problem is that side of the story was generally been ignored because for one reason or another, when the books have been and studies have been made about the US Army in Aachen, there was very little focus on the German side of the operations. In particular, for example, Wildt's report, which was published in 1954, which kind of went against what Eisenhower had said about the battle, and was very critical of what the Americans were saying to him about how the battle was fought. So from my perspective now, what I've been doing on Substack is I've been placing papers on Substack under the basis of Schlieffen's Ghost, under the section Schlieffen's Ghosts. And several papers have included things like a deeper examination of Bobby Brown's actions around Velout and Haida. I focused on Lawton Collins and his big errors in the Battle of Aachen, poor positioning, poor strategic positioning, and the poor decisions he made, which of course one of them being that he was intimidated to go into the Hürtgenwald. And I've also written a paper on Model because I think Model conned both Montgomery and Bradley in Arnhem and Aachen at much the same time. And if anyone was a victor of those two battles, it was Model. So, yeah, there's been a lot of, there is a lot of evidence out there. I chose, because of the nature of the reports, my chapters in the book, War Comes to Aachen, decided to write about what was effectively a non-battle in American lineage history, which has now been dramatized into some kind of remarkable urban warfare, which personally I tend not to agree with. I think there was a lot more politics going on in that battle than Americans in 1945, 46, 47 wanted to remember. And of course, the most obvious, how would I say it, ignoring the battle was Bradley, who in both memoirs barely mentioned the battle. And what I put in my book was the fact that he had mentioned Montgomery 329 times across 2 volumes, and he had mentioned Aachen 3 times. He also complained that one of the biggest problems with fighting at Aachen was the 500 Tiger tanks, which, you know, well, you know,
490 more than there really were.
So.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
I mean, we could get into the Hürtgen and Aachen and alternatives, which we may do later. We'll do a couple of maybe shorter questions. As you're talking about Aachen, then Jason gave us the question. Andreas' second question. Is there still stuff to see from the fighting in and around Aachen? I mean, you showed us bullet holes, you showed us bits and pieces of the then and now shots of the fighting through the streets there. So the simple answer is yes, but it's not like there are kind of organized tour routes with information panels you can kind of follow around, is it? You've got to do a bit more. You've either got to have someone like yourself there or an after battle magazine. But if you're visiting Aachen, what would your advice be, Dr. Phil?
Well, I wouldn't read After the Battle magazine because it's full of error. I did actually write to them in 2004 saying, would you like to rewrite this? Because I think you've made some errors, big errors. And they weren't a bit interested in doing a revised version. As I think when you came, we went to various places, one of which was the Adolf Hitler Schule in the Eifel National Park. which is connected to Aachen because many of the workforce from Aachen were taken there to work there. There's also the Siegfried Line, a massive fortification still possible to see. There's, of course, the linkage between Hürtgen and the Aachen battle and various places where you can see the fighting took place. And, of course, looking at the bombing war, which was a considerable part of my book, I don't know if you remember the massive bunkers I took you to. I think I took you to 3.
Yeah.
There's about 12. And all of those bunkers, including the medical bunker, where nearby where the 3 men were buried. I think I showed you that pose. And then we went off to the Zovizo for some beers because Colin was tired.
Yeah, indeed. Another question that's going to be right up your street from Ian Carr. They've got to find it because they're flying in still. Can Dr. Blood advise whether his research suggests the Kriegsmarine was complicit in the Nazi excesses as other branches ashore, including their POW camps and afloat? I mean, you famously discussed the Luftwaffe and your favorite person, Adolf Galland. You like him about as much as I like Guderian. But I mean, again, the simple answer is yes, they were complicit. But has your research gone into the Kriegsmarine specifically?
The only time when I specifically had to deal with Kriegsmarine papers was during my work on Hitler's bandit hunters, because the Kriegsmariners were running, I think the Americans would call it riverine operations. It's where you take gunboats sailing down the rivers, preventing partisans from crossing the rivers and shutting off areas. And the Kriegsmarine were very important in those operations. Their reports are fairly extensive. They kept as many prisoners until the SS or the German army took them off them because they didn't have the facilities on their boats to transport them. They're only small, flimsy affairs. Their riverine operations included taking light field artillery into operations with them. From what I know of the marine operations in places like Kiel, Bremerhaven, and the harbours, when they were constructing the ships and the maintenance of the ships, many of the work and slave labour was Jewish slave labour, and they worked in terrible conditions. There are photographs at the Krupp House in Essen, which has been turned into a national museum. There's many pictures there showing the slave labourers working on submarines and battleships. So yes, the Navy was very much part of it. It's always been a neglected side because obviously it's like the Luftwaffe. And everybody's very interested in reading about Galland flying around and, you know, all the good stuff that Hartmann does and shooting down all of these Russian aeroplanes and what have you. But the actual nature of National Socialist organizations like the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe and the army is you've got to understand how their mission statement worked and how that affected their culture. And the Kriegsmarine under Dönitz is, you know, there's lots of reasons why Dönitz was made Führer after Hitler decided to kill himself. Dönitz is in there. He committed his submarines to an aggressive style of warfare. They weren't very merciful. One of the biggest operations that is very interesting, which is the naval operations bringing people back from the east to cities in the west through the Baltic. There's a famous story of the Gustloff, the famous German cruise liner that is sunk with, I think, 1,500 people on board. Similar kind of tragedy to the Titanic. In that story, there is, well, what happened to all the Jews who were in the camps? Well, many of those Jews were forced to march back through Nazi Germany, and many of those camps that were on the coastline were under naval control, and it was naval troops that forced many of those slave labourers back into Nazi Germany as it began to shrink. So yes, the Kriegsmarine was very much part of the National Socialist system.
Thank you very much. So we did have a few questions about Hürtgen and Aachen. Whatever. So representative one from Terry Down was in a few minutes ago. Should the US First Army have simply ignored the Hürtgen forest, or B, devoted a major effort to an attack via Monschau south of the Col on the Ruhr dams? I mean, this is potentially another massive, great rabbit hole. And we didn't have you on when we were discussing the options the Allies were facing in sort of the autumn of 1944. We could do that at some point. I had Alan Allport on, Kevin Hiemel on, because the Allies have got options as to, are they trying to liberate peoples? Are they trying to gain territory? Or are they trying to attrit the German military? And they kind of go do various combinations of the above. But when you get to sort of September, October 1944, and the area where you are, the Hürtgen and Aachen, was there an option other than the one they did, Phil?
Well, they were doing really well. And they bounced out of Mons, which, you know, is one of those, everyone talks about fillets, and then we get to Aachen, you know, Cologne, blah. There's the big fight at Mons, and the US First Army does very well. And it's quite a fight there, and they capture, I think, 18,000 German soldiers, and they push on to Aachen. If you look at it from the ground level, soldiers like Bobby Brown, they're increasingly getting tired because the leading troops are not being rotated. So by the time Bobby Brown gets to Vallautenheide for his operations on the 7th of October 1944, he's been fighting almost continuously since 6th of June with very little respite. And okay, he's got battlefield commissions and all good things, but the problem is these troops are not getting any rest. And I think not only have you got one set of corps commanders like Lawton Collins in the 7th, and then Cowboy Pete on the 19th, kind of racing to get round Aachen, but at the same time, they're not putting themselves in fine strategic positions to look at where they're actually going. And I think the fascinating thing about Lawton Collins is he spends all of his memoirs telling us how well he knew the territory. But when he comes to giving talks to the US Army, whenever he's asked about Aachen and the Hürtgenwald, the only thing he ever says is, well, it was a hard fight and we didn't know the territory. So you always have this problem with the US Army commanders. For me, it's covering themselves for a grievous mistake. And the grievous mistake is the Stolberg and Aachen corridors are open. The Rhine is in front. I don't know if you remember, when I took you over the plain and we were driving towards Remagen, you could see how flat the country was. An army like the US Army taking on the German army on that kind of level is going to win. And instead of pushing on and beyond Aachen, they went for this half measure of, and again, it's always the same problem, putting a few regiments against a significant target and hoping that those small forces are going to do superhuman things. And as they bogged down against stiff resistance, they were too slow to push more troops forward. Meanwhile, as I've contended a few times now, people like, you know, generals like Model and his commanders are pushing at the American flank and saying, come here, trying to draw the Americans into the Hürtgenwald, which I think is a huge mistake. Now, my friend Roger Cirillo, as you know, he contends if they'd gone in there with five divisions instead of 3 divisions, you could have done it. Well, you know, I've taken you around that area. You can't very easily move troops through those huge
where do you fit them in?
windy roads. The whole thing's a nightmare. So, you know, why don't if you're so concerned about your flank, yeah, put an infantry division there to hold the line and carry on the swing towards the Rhine and Cologne. But for some reason, you get into this kind of friction between the First Army commander with Bradley, with Cowboy Pete, and there's all the arguments and toing and froing. You know, it's very interesting that the 19th Corps have taken this swinging move right the way round Aachen. They've done far better than Collins' 7th, yet the 7th gets the better write-up. I still don't get that. So would I have gone anywhere near the Hürtgen? No. But here's the thing. I think Bradley should have challenged more towards the Rhine, because the troops and reserves that were held in Wehrkreis 6, Military District 6, would have been brought to him and faced him and confront him, rather than being sent to Arnhem. If after those reserves were committed against Bradley, Montgomery did his move, Montgomery would have been over the Rhine. That would have forced the Germans to take a different stance, probably even withdraw to try and get across the Rhine. Then Bradley had an open door to get in. And I think if the Allied commanders were working in a better tandem and a better relationship, they would have seen that. But now you can't write history with hindsight. But what is the issue? The issue is the American Army commanders make bad decisions, significant bad decisions, from the 1st of September to the 30th of October.
Yeah, I mean, is it inevitable that after the Normandy campaign gets very attritional? We all know that, and it wears everybody down, both the victors and the defeated there. And then you get the kind of the honeymoon period of the post-Falaise pocket. You get the nipping up towards the French coast. You get the Patton's Third Army pushing across to the other side of France. So that everybody's kind of buoyed on, and despite pragmatism, people are starting to think, even foolishly, maybe we can get the war done by Christmas. Is it inevitable that they're going to hit a post-honeymoon slump, no matter where they fight, whether they decide to go into the Hürtgenwald or whatever? Do you think it's inevitable that a slump has to follow a period of an up?
I think there are those generals on both the American and British side who didn't think the Germans were an easy win, and they continued pushing.
Yeah.
There were those generals who decided, for one reason or another, perhaps because they were in Paris, that this was going to be over and a walkover by Christmas. And I think my concern here is what happens when Eisenhower takes control on the 26th of August. Because what actually happens is he loses control. He's got more control when he's got one commander running a show than he has when he's running all of them. Because what he ends up doing is having them all running off doing their own thing. And here's the classic. He's expecting, according to his memoirs, to place the German army in the West in an encirclement position, smashed against the Rhine, and he's going to liquidate them. Well, there was nowhere in any point that was ever going to happen, because as each American army is driving in different directions, it's attracting different parts of the German army to respond to those drives. I mean, that's the fascinating thing. It's almost like as the Americans and British talk about the war afterwards, they seem to think, the German army is this great mass. What they haven't really picked on is the fact that the German army is fractured into various parts and is responding in those parts to each of those thrusts as the Americans and the Brits move forward. Okay, there's different levels of resistance, but the German army is responding to those bit by bit. Now, if you'd have coordinated that instead of letting them all run around crazy, that could have been a mega win for the Allies before Christmas. I'm certain of it. But because you get into this this period after August 26, I don't see any coordination. And I think that's the problem. Because it's not coordinated, people are making decisions on the ground, and some of those decisions are good, but an awful lot of those decisions aren't. And they create problems for the Allied armies going on, which is why they don't get to Cologne till March 1945. That's an awful long time. And then you have to take into consideration something which, I find very interesting. When you look at the American Green Books, they will tell you that between Aachen and the end of the Ardennes offensive, upwards of 140,000 casualties were inflicted on the US Army. That's not just dead, that's dead, wounded, missing, and so forth, prisoners of war. If you include the losses of the British Armed Forces, which includes Arnhem and Scheldt and all of those, with the Canadian Army as well, and the Poles, you're looking at significant Allied casualties in a concentrated period. And who's responsible? Everybody blames Montgomery for what happens at Arnhem. How many people blame Eisenhower for the utter horror show that takes place from the moment he takes command to the defeat of the Ardennes offensive? And I think, I've always been of the opinion, the more I read this, the more it struck me that they're their own worst enemies. They are causing for themselves a greater burden. And they're making it easier for the Germans to defend. And that's why the Germans can fight out. And of course, in the end, they do the Ardennes offensive. Well, one set of troops are bogged down in a forest. I mean, think about the strategic analysis here. You've got your main army bogged down in a forest. You've got another one trying to get across in the Rhine. And you've got another one who's failed to get across the Rhine and is, feeling a bit hurt because he didn't get support from Bradley. And so it's a strange moment of, I don't know what you call it, unsettling. I find it unsettling that the Allies, the Allied command, which went from this incredible invasion, turns over some of the finest SS divisions and panzer divisions the German army ever produced, smashes them into smithereens. I mean, some of those divisions are walking away with one tank and 1,000 men. I mean, there's not many armies that are doing that, and the British Army and the American Army are absolutely written apart. And with the Royal Navy dragging those foolish SS men to stand too close to the coast and blowing them to pieces, that is just so clever. I mean, they took out von Schweppenberg's headquarters. That kind of capability suddenly evaporates from the 26th of August, and there's all this chaos. And of course, we know what happens after the war. They all write books about how badly the other one was. So maybe that's a bit controversial for this time.
Are the Allies better when there's only kind of one obvious option ahead of them? So, they've got to plan a second front. So all these disparate commanders with different personalities, and you've got to remember there's a multinational force involved in Operation Overlord. So they're all singing that same hymn sheet because that's the option. But you get to that sort of September, even August, September period in 44, there are lots of options as to which way to go, which campaign to focus on. I mean, with Graham Bowman was on talking about, Churchill's options, the Mediterranean. There's Yugoslavia, there's Italy, there's Greece, there's the south of France upwards. Are too many options difficult for a democratic team in some ways, because you end up with this diluting of ideas and ambition and organization?
Well, I think there's so much treasure to be had. And when I say treasure, there's all this opportunity that Germany's open there, laid open, and the Allies have pretty much effectively annihilated the German army in the West. How come within a month the German army has been able to rebuild itself? Well, part of it is, allowing Army Group G, is it, to escape from the Arnhem operation, and then you've got Scheldt, which is an open. And I know all the arguments about, they haven't got supply. Well, okay, but they seem to have enough supply to do pretty porous military operations like Aachen. It's just, I'm looking at it from the German side, so I see the world very differently. And I understand, America's got all this military equipment coming through, and the British Army's shortage of soldiers and NCOs. I understand all of those arguments, but if you look at it from the other side of the fence, you've got to wonder what the Americans and the British are thinking as their opponent is collapsing, and they're not taking advantage of it. Or they're taking advantage of it, but piecemeal. I think Roger says, killing the German army 1 battalion at a time, which is a fair argument.
Yeah, good point. There's some other questions. Let's try and do a quicker one. Not that I'm not enjoying it there. Well, actually, this isn't going to be a quicker one at all. But anyway, regarding the brutality of the German army's activities, e.g., the treatment of civilians, could part of this culture be caused by its tradition of severe corporal punishment for enforcing discipline? This is something you kind of half touched on the show last week. Is discipline and having that kind of system of not blind obedience, but there's the question. There is
an element of blind obedience, but when the German army commits itself in the Herero War and destroys 80,000 of 100,000 population, it's doing something which is beyond corporal punishment and brutality. It's going into or falling into that horrible word, genocide. And they're committing genocide in the most heinous ways. There's not just the machine gun bullets. There's headhunting. There's forcing people into the desert so they die of famine. And then they're putting people on Shark Island and watching them die because they're not going to feed them. So there's a whole series of processes that are taking place in 1904. It's not so bad in the First World War in the sense that they're not committing so much blatant killing, but there is killing. And there's killing of the Belgian civilians in 1914 on the excuse that they're franc tireurs or partisans, like there had been in 1871. And John Horn and Kramer have shown that a lot of it was just excuse and propaganda. But the fact of the matter is the German army did use extreme tactics in 1914. And of course, it continued into the destruction of people in the so-called German Revolution after 1918, 1919, with the brutal killings of people like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. But that kind of Freikorps violence then doesn't exactly go away, but it calms. And then you see the political infighting between the Nazis and the communists and the various political movements in the unsteady 30s coming after the Great Crash, when Germany is suffering such huge economic privations. And, when by the time Hitler's come to power, you think, well, okay, it's all going to be fairly calm and restful, but it's not, because in 1934 he decides to take out Ernst Röhm and the SR leadership, and many of the German army officers are involved, and also, very carefully pushing inconvenient generals in the way of SS bullets. So you've got a certain level of violence, but I think what happens with the German army after 1936 is this process of radicalization, which starts in 1938 with the famous Crystal Night, Night of Broken Glass activities when the SS beat up Jews in the streets. And it and the army isn't involved directly, but there are participants. I mean, we found when I was doing the research in Aachen, many of the local German soldiers got involved in the various actions. And then, of course, in 1939, they commit extreme killings in Poland, actually in front of Leni Riefenstahl. So it's not like they're, it's beyond corporal punishment. It's a continuity of extreme and brutal violence, which the German army will commit to as and when it feels like it. And there is no evidence of people saying, well, soldiers saying, no, I don't want to do this. They do it. And as I found with the Luftwaffe battalions in Białowieża, you didn't need superior orders for a Luftwaffe corporal or private soldier to pick up a gun and shoot a Jew or a partisan or a civilian. It was just they're the enemy. They were described as vermin, and they killed them. And that kind of language and that level of destruction of the other, as we sometimes use the term, is sadly a red thread that goes through the story of the German army from 1900. Again, when they were doing similar things in China, right the way through till 1945.
Okay, thank you. North Africa, King of Battle book. Where do you see the North African campaigns in the effect they had on the war and on the German army? Now, before I let you answer that, since hosting this channel, I've realized that the North Africa and Torch, Tunisia, I think has a lot more impact on the ETO from the British Army and the Americans' point of view than perhaps I thought about 10 years ago. From the German Army's point of view, there are lots of people who say the German Army shouldn't have sort of bothered at all in North Africa, and et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of your work in the ETO, where do you see the influence of North Africa on the battles you've been talking about earlier, the Aachen, Hürtgen, 44?
Well, the direct issue with the legacy of North African campaign is the fact that Rommel is initially the commander to face the invasion. Rommel comes back from being ill again and is put into command of a Munich military sector, which involves him planning for operations in Yugoslavia against the partisans. If those operations had gone ahead, I think Rommel's reputation would have taken a very different trajectory. I've always thought that. The fact that just as the operation started, he got shifted to Normandy is neither here nor there. But he is kind of the direct element. But I think if we go back to something I discussed way back when I was talking about Rommel, Rommel had some of the new equipment turn up, like some Tiger tanks, and he had some Hermann Goering troops and some reinforcement in late 1942, early 43. But if you look at what's actually happening on the mainland, so to speak, on continental Europe, the German army has already changed many times its doctrines and its dogma and its style of fighting. It's got Panther tanks coming through, it's got Tiger tanks coming through. I mean, those alone are not going to make a huge difference to the overall style of German fighting. But the fact that Rommel isn't part of those changes because he's been excluded, he knows, he sees, he hears, he's informed about what's those changes, and I'm sure he can adjust to the new equipment as it's coming through. But he's isolated in North Africa. And while it's a good place for the Germans to play their maneuver warfare with the small number of divisions, they're not having the slightest bit of effect on people like Rundstedt and Model. Model's cutting his teeth against large Soviet forces, Red Army forces, in huge battles, which are dwarfing anything that was happening with Rommel's operations. So you've got to look at it that there's that world, and then there's the North African world, and there's the ETO, and that the ETO is going its way. And to a certain extent, you can see that Rommel, he's given a lot of free rein because really, how interested are they? There's a huge propaganda focus when Tobruk's taken. but Alexandria isn't taken, so that doesn't lead to anything. The Battle of El Alamein is mentioned in dispatches, but there's no big deal about it like you have with Stalingrad. And when it's all over in Tunisia, it's a case of so what? There's a couple of Oberkommando Wehrmacht articles in which Italian generals are shown to be heroes, but it's not substantial. And so the ETO, I think, it's interesting to read about. It's interesting. Don't get me wrong. I'm not dismissing it. I'm saying the rest of the German army dismissed it because they were in a different reality.
Yeah.
And if you're one of the 127 German divisions that are fighting on the Eastern Front in 41, 42, I mean, what's going on in Africa is incidental to their lives. It has no bearing whatsoever. And it's not like there was the extraction of raw materials or special fruit and all the rest of it that was feeding into the German economy, and everybody was saying, oh, look, we got bananas from Africa. It's almost like a non-event.
Yeah. I was amazed when I found out, I forget which book on El Alamein it was I was reading. But, there's Churchill ordering the bells to peal from the churches of the UK. It's major news for days and days, the turning point, blah, blah, blah. But as you said, it's kind of relegated to page 5 of German newspapers because it's the equivalent to them of, I don't know, the invasion of Madagascar to the Allies. It's happening, but it's so far down the list. And it's that thing that we're always talking about in this channel is perceptions are different depending on where you're standing. And certain countries are seeing certain campaigns with way more significance than other countries are. But anyway, another great question for you. I'm not going to ask you this one because you're going to do a big smile. I may say this one for later. It says, can you talk about German railway guns? But we'll save that. Before we get to there. No, not this one. Where is it? The one I'm trying to find there? Yeah, from Gordy. Is Philip familiar with Brian Horrocks' decision to bomb Cleves and the toll it took on him afterward? It's around 100 miles up the road from Aachen. So Brian Horrocks, most people know of him. It's Market Garden. It's Edward Fox doing the speech there, blah, blah, blah. But Horrocks involved in lots more of World War II of significance than just that. And I've read about that in Cleves. So are you familiar with that? And what's your opinion?
Well, you may or may not know, but in 1967 or thereabouts, Brian Horrocks used to be on BBC television describing all the battles of the Second World War.
Yeah.
On one times there would be Little Hart, and other times there would Brian Horrocks. So in my youth, I would see Brian Horrocks quite often. And one of the ones he did actually talk about was the bombing of Cleves. Now, the interesting thing about Brian Horrocks and Cleves is there are 3 occasions when he says he found it very uncomfortable. The first is this 67, 68 program when he was talking about the Battle of the Reichswald and the fighting in that area. The second time it turns up is in one of the episodes of The World at War. And then the third is, I think he gave a talk to Sandhurst about the fighting. I think it was in the 60s, saying that the biggest problem was Cleves because, quote, it was linked to Anne of Cleves. There was this familial relationship from history. It was all there. Now, I don't know if he went through all of that pain, but the bombing of Cleves, if you go there, it's like any of these German cities that have been completely flattened. Concrete blocks everywhere with a little bit of reconstructed old buildings and the Schloss on top of the hill. Interestingly, it was also an area where the Nazis were recreating back in the 30s a Roman site at Xanthon. And they actually built an amphitheatre, which is very similar to many of the Nazi buildings. And they have, and what you see is this Nazi interpretation of a Roman amphitheatre. But anyway, by the by, I digress. The The fighting round there, if you go round it and you have a look, it's going to be tough. And he's made a decision, which, how many American and British generals and senior officers destroyed French villages and towns in the Normandy area and further out to try and destroy German resistance. I think Brian Horrocks regretted what he did, because I think on reflection he realized it didn't really do anything. The reason why I was there was I was looking at Meindl and Fallschirmjäger. I was leading a tour back in the day of people who were interested in the Fallschirmjägers, so I was going around the battlefield. And then in 2019 I went there again on the way for the Arnhem celebrations, and so I was able to look at the ground afresh. It's an interesting battlefield. You can understand why he would want to take that high point out, but I think it remained with him for the rest of his life. Have I answered the question?
I always remember. It's been a while since I watched The World at War, but he always seemed open. He always seemed that he was genuinely projecting his opinions on things. Whereas even as a young man, when I first watched it, I felt some people were saying what they thought they should be saying, very kind of like a political interview. He always felt, I don't necessarily like everything he said but I always felt he was one of the ones who was more honest than some, if that makes sense. And I think we'd love to have a discussion with you one day, Phil, about The World at War and its influences, because I can't see any of us. It's a bit like Stephen Ambrose. We can't ignore its significance, and yet we can look back and say, yeah, there was some dodginess about it, but incredibly important as well. But we can do that. We'll save World at War for a future thing. So, completely random question. We'll get to the trains in a minute. From Gary. Unrelated to World War II, presumably you met Henry Kissinger personally, on his views as to working with him and what he was like as a person. Because, you always mentioned on your Substack, you did work alongside, they did your NATO work and stuff. So Kissinger, the Dr. Phil Blood interpretation.
Well, first of all, he was an old man by that stage. Let me give the story a little bit color. I became one of the chief executive operations officers for the American Academy in Berlin, and I was also involved with the Fellows, which is it's an academic academy developing American-German relations. And at the time, I was working with the U.S. Army's Association of U.S. Army, and heavily involved with Washington, D.C., where I was consulting on military history on behalf of General Gordon Sullivan and General Richard Trefry. And of course, I was working alongside Roger Cirillo. And I was asked if I would commit to a job at the American Academy based on mostly on my business qualifications, because they felt they needed to deal with the problem of the forthcoming financial crash. So you've got the financial crash, which was my primary task. And there was also an issue with Henry Kissinger, which I believe was due to Christopher Hitchens declaring him a war criminal. So Henry didn't come to Germany quite often because there was a constant fear of arrest and so forth. And so I think I first met him in New York at one of our council meetings. And by that stage, he was a very old man. And the first time I heard him talk in a board meeting, he talked about Obama coming to power, where America was going. I and I'll be honest, I thought at the time that he was perhaps not with the finger on the button. He made a comment which has stayed with me ever since, which was that Putin had passed his best and Russia was finished. And I thought that was kind of not for me. I'd obviously knew about Kissinger from my youth when there was the bombing and the Vietnam War and such and so forth. But as I say, by that stage, he was an elderly person, and he was, very sharp-minded, very polite, open to questions, and we had discussion. But as I say, by that stage, he aged significantly, and so his commentary, his discussion, it was valid, it was important, but I think he kept to a line of reasoning and argument which was perhaps old and past rather than what was coming. And I think when I look back on some of the things he said about Obama, I think he got that story wrong. I think he got the future, he came up with ideas about the future of American foreign policy and the way it was going to go. And I think, we all saw what happened today. I think we can all say that what happened with Henry's kind of attitudes towards American foreign policy sadly passed with him. I'm not saying that everything he did was good. In fact, most of the time, a lot of his ideas were outrageous. But I think there was an attitude that the code of laws at least had some meaning, and now we seem to live in an age where social media determines whether we go to war or not.
I mean, it's coming up in a survey. Clearly very intelligent, but also a little bit sketchy. A little bit. We general public don't like people too intelligent. We don't like them stupid either, but we don't like them too sharp. It's always a bit worrying. But great response to that. Well, we're getting so many requests to let you talk about trains, so I'll put the question up there again. It was specifically about railway guns, but if you want to talk about any other aspect of trains, I mean, you always manage to bring trains into the conversation. Even when you were talking about Manchester United, I think you managed to bring in trains at some point. But the railway guns are an interesting thing because First World War, Second World War, it's one of those things that was to some extent propagandized. We can all think of those footage of guns wheeling up and down up tunnels, things like that, and the Allies used them as well. But in terms of World War II, what's your reaction to railway guns? A big kind of damp squib, or very significant, or something in between?
Well, actually, they have quite an interesting strategic role. And I'm going to be quick now because I know you've got people stacking up. So I followed the use of the heavy guns, first of all in the Crimea in 1942, when they were used as siege guns to smash the Soviet naval harbour and the fortifications there. But then in 1944 in Warsaw, Baksalevsky took Thor, I think it was Thor, to work on further destruction of the Warsaw suburbs, landing those heavy shells on the city. What is less well known is he then took that to the Ardennes operations in the Southern Theatre, and he actually took the train with him with the gun. And then later, when he was up at Schwerin area with Skorzeny, the guns were brought to there. I can't honestly remember what happened to all of the guns now. Some were captured, some were destroyed, some were melted down. But they did have a strategic role in urban destruction.
Right.
And again, the reason why they were valuable for the German army is you could bring up this massive firepower on trains. So here's the trains bit. If you don't have that train system, then the infantry armies don't work. And when I say infantry armies, I'm obviously meaning horse-drawn carriages and all the rest of it. You need some form of heavy carrier to move your equipment. And the railways literally underwrite the German armies, both in the east and in the west. I mean, you know, the amount of reserves that they were pushing into Normandy, you know, to me has always raised questions about Second Tactical Air Force and its capability of stopping the railways. Yet the reserves were still coming in because the Germans had this internal system of movement, you know, the idea of Jomini's internal lines. So you can move big guns along subsidiary lines without too much problem. And the Germans used their railways to bring up heavy guns and flat guns and reserves and support and fodder right to the very end of the war. It was their strongest strategic arm. But I'm not going to go on about my favourite steam engines because I think that's enough.
Oh, we could do a top in a future episode. Dr. Phil's 10 favorite steam engines. Yeah, that would bring a certain type of audience in.
All two of them.
Chris is asking you, will you be writing any future books with an aviation theme? I mean, obviously your Aachen book is sort of a 360 account. It's the ground battle, but it's also the politics. It's a social, but you talk about the air war extensively. You did those couple of podcasts with Matt Bowen on the aviation show. But so clearly the air war and strategic bombing is something you're interested in. But do you feel yourself targeting, bad pun there, aviation in terms of a future book?
There was a huge amount of archives drawn for the Aachen book. Just to give you an idea, with all of those raids, I think we were up to, at one point, over 300 files just on bombing operations, support lines, connections. Even there were 20 files on downed airmen who were killed, buried in Aachen, then moved. I followed that story right away into the 50s with how British airmen were supposedly honoured for having died in service and killed in action. And I challenged that. I kind of started to shift away and saw what was actually happening was they were burying them far out of the way and hopefully forgotten forever, which is what happens at several of the Royal Air Force or Royal Air Force dominated graveyards in West Germany. They're places where nobody visits, nobody's interested. And if you look at the crew, it's very interesting. You know, you either get the full set of 5-7 crewmen, or you get the one pilot. And it you know, I look at them and I think, yeah, the pilot was the last man out of the airplane, or he kept it going so the others could get out. So, you know, there's huge stories. I went through all the bomber losses. I went through all the raids on Aachen. I did raids on Cologne. I used my past operational research studies to re-go through all the formulas, work out why the upward firing machine guns on the German aircraft were being miscalculated. The researcher, I think his name's Fetterman, who was at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, gave a talk in which he said one of the biggest problems with the Royal Air Force Bomber Command Operational Research Centre was they over-focused on the upward firing guns and never came to terms with it. I went through the calculations and I could see the errors. I did some swarm analysis with how the bomber swarms actually worked, both in and out, and how the German fighters infiltrated them and intercepted certain bombers. And I actually followed quite a lot of bombers in their journeys, individual bombers. I also did some work on the photo reconnaissance pilots. There's a pilot who's buried down the road, and on his grave it says, he was a man, or this was a man. And it just seemed to be incredible. To me, that was that was Royal Air Force law with LORE meaning law. It was like the culture. They generated this capability, and their families were not. There wasn't. It wasn't. How would you put it? It wasn't epigrams which said things like, "Oh, our dear lost son," or all the rest of it. They seemed to suggest the airmen were of this higher quality, and they wanted to celebrate it, even though their son had been killed in action at the age of 23 in a Spitfire. And you see that one plot, that one little grave, and you think, well, that's got to be a story. The problem is, at some stage, I actually want to stop writing and play with my train set or my model soldiers, and writing.
I like your honesty there. I want to stop writing and play with my soldiers. I feel your pain. I feel your pain. Because you gave me a look before we went online, folks. Phil asked me what I did yesterday for my birthday, and I said that Mag and I had sat and watched some episodes of Call the Midwife last night. And Phil gave me a look. I don't quite know how to describe it really, but it was surprise, but also like, really. Anyway, it was quite funny. But we're getting lots of feedback about a steam engine special. So fuck it, let's do it. But a very specific question from Gregory here, which. We'll find out how this goes down. Does Dr. Blood know anything about how aggressive the assimilation of the German communities absorbed into Belgium was during the interwar period, and whether it was exploited for propaganda? I'm assuming, because Gregory has toured with me, that that's your family ancestry, that part of Belgium there. I mean, because we always have to remind ourselves just how many bloody times borders changed between about 1900 and 19... Well, they're still changing, aren't they? But do you know about that particular aspect?
Right. Well, if you remember when you first arrived in the Aachen area and we went for a drive, we went through Verviers, and then we went to Velkenrath. And in Velkenrath, I took you into a church with all the German dead, all the young German dead, mostly killed between 14 and 18. Cleves is one of those towns which was Aachen, in the Aachen Stadtregion, and was taken over by the Belgian government, I think, in 1919. There were plebiscites in the area, in Cleves and Eupen, and the way it's portrayed in the local Echo, which was a newspaper, the Grenz Echo, the Border Echo, in the local newspaper here, it was claimed that numbers up to 99% wanted to remain in Germany, but the Belgians refused to grant the rights of the individuals who voted against going into Belgium. There are various books that were published by the Nazis in 1940 celebrating the fact that some of these towns were taken over again. I've managed to collect as much as I could. There's a Belgian German historian called Herbert Ruland, who's a very nice guy. He's done some incredible research work in the locality, and he's produced some massive books. I'll try and pass the message to you, Woody, and give you the details, and then perhaps you can pass it on to people or lodge it here at a later date, because Herbert Ruland, Ruhland, he's produced these books. They're very expensive locally, like €60 for 1,000 pages, massive big book things with pictures. The trend over here with the Dutch and the Belgians producing these lavish books. But if he's interested in that kind of story, then Herbert Ruland's works are very valuable.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer? Yep.
It does. There are some other questions, but I'm going to save some because I want to ask you one last question yourself. So, you referenced people like Roger Cirillo. You talked about on your Substack, and folks, the link to Phil's Substack is in the description below. Your discussion with Jürgen Zimmerer. You've talked about other historians that are, shall we say, the north of 50 years old. Do you have hope for the future? I know Alex Churchill spent some time with you a couple of years ago over there in Aachen, but you can perhaps be seen a little bit curmudgeonly, I think, as some people. And I love you to bits, Phil, but are you optimistic about the future? Do you think there are young people coming through and by young I don't necessarily mean in their 20s, I mean younger than us. Do you see, have you got hope for the future in terms of, I don't mean like operational studies, I mean real in-depth understanding of World War II, the kind of lens you try and look at that conflict through? Do you have hope for the future?
I think, first of all, before we... yes. Good. Yes, I have hope for the future. So, but the problem is the young academics, I'm going to focus on young academics. Young academics get very quickly focused into a specific subject. So I think most of us know or are aware of Jake Halliday. He's working on Bialystok. He's on Twitter. He has an interest in operations in the East and the destruction of the synagogue in Bialystok in 1941. He's done an awful lot of research, but to a lot of people, they would say, well, he's very narrow compared to you because he's only focused on 1941. It's a huge subject. And the problem that we have with German military history, if you put it in that context, is there's over, whatever it is, 600 tons of paper, and we probably worked through about a ton of it. And, there's so much still to go through. The Kriegsmarine has never been really studied. Yeah. Okay, the Luftwaffe's papers were destroyed in 1945 by Luftwaffe personnel under Goering's orders. But there are papers and there are files, and you can find them. And I know to a certain extent, Victoria Taylor has done some interesting work on the Luftwaffe in 1940. The problem is, though, for me, it's interesting to hear about what happened in 1940 with the Luftwaffe. But for me, it's more of a structural thing. You've got to understand fundamentally what the Luftwaffe is before you can start looking at its battles and its fighting. Yeah. And that's why I went down the road of explaining in serious detail how they created an honor system which was linked between the flyers and hunting. And it dated back to Richthofen. So you could see the trajectory. Now, I know that an awful lot of Luftwaffe people who are interested in Luftwaffe don't want to know about things like honor courts and social honor, or the fact that I found cases where the Luftwaffe Stuka pilots and the Fallschirmjäger in Norway were fighting each other. Yeah. And when I told that to a famous historian who's written about that region recently, I said, look, they absolutely went to war at each other in an honor court, and there was all kinds of mayhem, and it's written there in the court-martial records of the Wehrmacht. No interest whatsoever. For me, it's fascinating that kind of documentary content is still there and awaiting somebody who is interested to exploit that information. I think if young people are given the opportunity to explore, I'm going to use me as an example. Richard Holmes said, you ain't doing this for just one book, and you ain't doing this for 10 books, and you're not just going to focus on the SS, blah, 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 for the rest of your life. You're going to do history, aren't you? And I said, obviously, because what's the point of doing a PhD and doing all this research if I'm only going to be stuck in a tranche? So Holmes, from the very beginning, was every time you see a branch, follow it.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting comment. Every time you see a branch, follow it, and I have done. And one of the other things that we used to talk about was distributions. People would read papers from German archives and miss the last page, which would have 50 distribution contacts, everything. So you knew where documents were going. So I knew that Dillevanger's papers were not just landing on the SS desk, they were landing on the Wehrmacht desks.
Yeah.
So to a certain extent, what I would like to see, if I was going to suggest anything, is supervisors being less tight on what students study and give them more freedom of expression.
Yeah.
I had a student here in Aachen she was very interested in developing ideas about the women's side of the Nazi Party in Aachen, and she was working on the Aachen project. I just said, well, go ahead and do it. And I think sometimes you need to say to young people, go ahead and do it. But I think we live in a guardian society. So if you say something, if I said something about somebody as a historian, I didn't like their book, they take it personally. It becomes a battle.
Yeah.
Immediately it's hostility. I don't like lots of books. I don't write about it because, it's going to lead to all kinds of fights, and I'm listed as a curmudgeon. But you can still like the person.
I don't mean you said that.
You could like the first book, you could like the second book, but dislike the third book. It's just the way things are. But I see a lot of young people coming through. I read Alex's book with Nicholas. I thought it was okay. They're cutting some interesting interpretations of the Great War. I think Jake's work will probably cut an awful lot because he did something which students should do. He decided to go off and look for an alternative of all alternatives. So he went onto eBay, identifying war diaries and photographs and records which were being sold onto the eBay system. And okay, he was confronting huge cash issues, but it's still evidence that he's secured. And I think there's other people like that. There's my friend Johnny Ware, who we both know, who does his kind of research, which is much wider. And when we look at, he very kindly let me read his volumes on the Welsh division, and the scale and depth of Johnny's research is absolutely stunning. I mean, it's the kind of thing that I like. I know a lot of people don't like that kind of thing, but he's got volumes and volumes of study there. And I think there's other stories, other people who have, like Johnny Briggs. He worked on I think it's is it the 4th Armoured or the 11th Armoured? I can't remember the British Armoured Division that he focused on, but he was looking at the training and learning about battle while they were in the field, and translating it into improved combat tactics for the tank men as they're fighting their way through. 4th Armoured Brigade, that was it.
Yeah.
So there are some really, really good young and to middle-aged academics who are producing some wonderful stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that the important thing, and this is where we kind of lose stuff in the debates between popular and academic, if you don't have guys going through, and I mean guys generally, I mean men and women, if you don't have guys going into the archives, extracting stuff and doing stuff like Niels Henkerman or the Dutch lads, producing the kind of the works that we're doing, this stuff isn't going to come out.
Yeah.
And we depend on that kind of level of research. So I'm very hopeful that it's going to continue to get better. But there are issues out there, but I'd rather be on a positive note in our group discussion than mention about the bad things.
No, I mean, I'm with you. I mean, John Ware, to be exact, is an example of someone who's got an all-rounder's knowledge that he's focusing on something quite specific. But he's bringing that. He understands gear, he understands battle dress and tanks and rifles, and because he's come from that background as well. And so, I see that I'm finding there are less all-rounders. There are people who are very good on one thing, very, very good on one thing. Bud Bowie, who's coming on, who did the artillery show you loved, and he was obviously American military for a long time. He's got one coming up on strategic bombing, and he first said, I know about that as well as I know about artillery. He's someone who's come at it from a very broad perspective, but then can use that broadness to then create a discussion about a smaller subject within that, but he's drawing on this wider knowledge. I mean, there are lots of people like Michael Ackerman, my friend, who just been messaging me while we're talking, who if I was in a pub quiz with him and that question came up about how thick was the concrete of the Tobruk at Widerstandswehr 62 on February the 3rd, 1943, he'd be able to tell me that. But if that question about Omaha Beach didn't come up, I'm not sure. I mean, he has got. I'm downplaying. He does have a very extensive knowledge of World War II, but he would understand what I mean about his focus is so specific, and it's good. Like Niels Henkermann's, it's great, fantastic work on the German archives about the Battle of Normandy. But I worry about there not being many all-rounders going forward. I'm an all-rounder, although I'm not in your league.
Well, I hear what you say. I mean, from another side, you'd think somebody like Matt Bone, who's an aviation historian, who's into aeroplanes and all the good stuff, bombers and fighters and everything. The interesting thing, and I'm not sure I'm letting out any secrets here, but he was discussing with me the fact that he'd been looking at German Luftwaffe flak papers and research papers, and he was saying a lot of the things that I'd been talking about he picked up on. He had seen it now in the file, and he had an interesting perspective then on how the flak units operated, which I think we're going to learn from. And he said, I'm only doing an Osprey book. I actually think it's a valuable Osprey book because he's talking about the Typhoons and his favorite aircraft and the flak guns. But in there, he discovered that a lot of the flak regiments on the ground are being quite unpleasant to the local communities they're in, either stealing food or attacking civilians or arresting them. And that's the reality of the occupation that surrounds the flak guns. Now, back in the day when I started, you'd have Kenneth Maxey who would say, well, this book's only going to be about the military of the SS second SS division or some such. And first of all, you knew what that meant was he wasn't going to do any of the politics. You knew he wasn't going to mention the SS as an illegal Nazi organization. But what I found later in life as I'm reading this stuff was he's saying it's not going to be a political book, but all the way through, his political language was shaping the narrative of the book, which I thought was quite incredible. So there.
Well, I feel we could continue this conversation for a long time, but we will bring it to an end because it's just coming up for 2 hours. So, Phil, I think you fielded these questions pretty well, and someone did say that your conclusions about the Hürtgen Forest were pretty much similar to Montgomery and Brooke, but I didn't throw that one at you because I didn't want to see what your face would be to that one, whether you would be pleased or not pleased or somewhere in between. But as always with you, you leave me partially satisfied because you always answer things, but you present more questions for me to go and think about because that's what you do, and you do it very well. So, folks, if you haven't seen any of Dr. Blood's previous appearances, the links in the description below. Go and check out his Substack. There's some great articles there. And tomorrow we have a fantastic story. Mark is joining us from Belfast. He was on a couple of years ago talking about the Royal Ulster Rifles. He's talking about a fantastic story he uncovered of one of the young people who was taken out on a train from Austria and ended up researching what happened to the family that was left behind under the Nazis. That'll be a fantastic show. I'm looking forward to that one. And then lots more coming up. So thank you, Phil. Thank you, viewers. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers. Thank you.